Good afternoon, and thank you so much for coming. My name is Ellen Fay. I'm co-lead of the Land Use for Net Zero Nature and People Hub's Soil Health and Carbon Dynamics Topic Advisory Group. For short, we call that the LUNS Soil Tag. I'm joined by my co-lead on the Soil Tag, Professor Pete Smith of Aberdeen University, and my colleagues Matthew Orman and Tilly Kimberwild, and our panel of speakers who Pete will introduce in just a moment. So LUNS is a 40-month UK government-funded project. It's now in its final year, and it looks to bridge the gap between research, policy and practice around how land use can achieve an effective and equitable transition towards net zero. Over the course of the programme, it's been our job at the Soil Tag to examine where soil sits within this challenge, to identify and address the soil-specific threats and opportunities, as well as technical, economic and policy issues that lie at the heart of this transition. As part of this, we've looked at soil carbon, soil biodiversity, nationwide and in-field soil monitoring, and we've brought experts from across the soil landscape to share with us their knowledge and insights. Today's workshop deals with soil and water in the resilient landscape. It's a follow-up to a workshop we hosted towards the end of last year, which examined the relationship between soil and flooding. That was recorded, and it's available alongside a series of briefing notes on the LUNS Hub website. Now, today we're going to take a slightly different look at this issue of soil and water. It's a bit more of a general view of soil's water holding capacity, encompassing also the question of drought. So drought and flood together, and exploring the methods being developed to understand, measure and influence how soil impacts on water movement through the landscape. This reflects a growing recognition in the face of recent extreme weather that water is a critical risk factor for governments, both local and national, but it's also for a growing number of business sectors becoming extremely important. That's not just food and drink, but also insurance, transport, and the water industry itself, and even the technology sector, who now recognise water as both environmentally and economically material for their operations and critical for business resilience. They're looking to understand this dynamic and what they should do about it, from conceptualising soil degradation as a material risk factor to assessing their exposure as businesses, measuring change over time, targeting investment, and even reporting on their exposure and their impact. So we hope this workshop will be a step in the direction of clarifying some of these interdependencies. Despite its obvious significance, soil and water is a relatively novel topic. And so to kickstart, we've decided to involve representatives of projects from across the country who are at the coalface and the cutting edge of addressing and filling this knowledge gap. They're diverse organisations with diverse backgrounds, but all united by an interest in landscape-based thinking and the use of environmental data collection, incentives, education, targeted interventions, and collaboration on drivers of land management change. And we're really grateful to have them here with us today. So just some quick housekeeping before we kick off. This workshop will be recorded and shared following the event alongside the slides and the workshop report. So if we have the next slide, please, Tilly, and I'll hand over now to Pete to introduce our panel of speakers and to guide us through the presentations.
Thanks very much, Ellie. So thanks so much for joining us. We have Kat Brown from the Lens Company, who will be talking to us about the Landscape Enterprise Networks model, the Lens model. We have Kat Moncrief, who's the Head of Policy Engagement of CIWEM, who'll talk to us about the Spongy Landscapes Policy Brief. Then we have Søren Petersen, who's the Water Stewardship Manager from the Rivers Trust, who'll talk to us about the Volumetric Water Benefit Accounting Methodology, the VWBA. And then we have Emily Brown, who's an environmental scientist at Atkins Realis, who will talk to us about the soil carbon and water resilience project. So thanks very much for joining us. It's great to have experts, and as Alice said, people working at the cutting edge of this issue. It's great to have you here. So without further ado from me, I'm going to hand over to Kat Wallace. So Kat, when you're ready.
Thank you, Pete. No, I'm appearing on screen. Yeah, thank you. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak today to talk about our LENS initiative, the Landscape Enterprise Networks. I'm the LENS Impact Director. I've been with LENS for over 3 years now and focusing entirely around our impact measurement and reporting. So we'll be speaking around our soil health and resilience building examples from LENS. Next slide, please. I'll be going through what it is that we do, why we exist, and then going into a bit more how we define resilience in LENS and the types of impact metrics that we have been collecting over the years and the first results that we're seeing in our different landscapes. And then I'll open up on a few reflections linked to this workshop. Thank you. So what is LENS? LENS is a mission-based organisation. We started in 2021, so just short of 5 years. And our mission is to bring organisations together to co-fund regenerative agriculture and nature-based solutions to drive a landscape resilience. So we're very much at the heart of what the Lundstag team are trying to do around soil health and understanding to resilience. We started in 2021 in non-landscape from what was a project built by 3Keel, a sustainability company in the UK. And we've now grown out to being a dedicated team, only working on delivering LENS in now 8 landscapes in the UK and Europe, where we have over 400 farms actively delivering these different practices that are funded through LENS, and over 30 million euros have now been, committed to those farmers in those different landscapes. So this is not just a model or a concept. This is a real life initiative that is operational for the past 5 years. Next slide, please, Pete. Thank you. So this is just a snapshot of some of the landscapes we're active in. And the point here on the slide is to show you that every landscape brings across different stakeholders, and therefore their interests in that landscape are a little bit different depending on the types of entities involved. So, for example, East of England, that has been our longest running landscape, now sees about 10 funders coming back every year to pay for measures. Their primary interest tends to revolve around flood management, soil health, habitat creation, nutrient management, and farmer innovation. And you'll see that those icons differ a little bit depending on the region, and again, depending on the makeup of those funders in those regions. And that's down to the types of entities that are interested in the landscape and what they want to gain from resilience building. And I'll come on to that in a while. Next slide, please. So I think what we need to understand about LENS is that we're really anchored into the real world economy in terms of the entities that are funding us. They have material interest in those landscapes because they directly affect either their supply of materials to their factories, or because there are constituents in that landscape that are potentially experiencing natural risks that need avoiding. So these are just examples of the types of risk factors that are matter to those entities and the reason why they are fully invested into those landscapes. So these are just a few examples of our funders in LENS and why they might decide to join one of our initiatives. Moving to the next one, please, Pete. Again, I think what characterizes our model is that we work in partnership with a variety of stakeholders, and every landscape's different. So you'll see there's quite a multitude of different funders involved in LENS. We have typically a lot of food and beverage companies involved, but also water sector is equally quite involved. So Anglian Water, for example, and Affinity are both regular funders to our East of England landscape. United Utilities is involved in Cumbria, and then our Southern and Scottish Electric utility company is involved in our Scottish landscapes. We're also very much working with and are being funded by local councils such as the West Northamptonshire Council and the North Yorkshire Council and Perth and Kinross Council, which is great to have that diversity of entities engaging with us. And in some landscapes also the insurance sector and the banking sector have started to come on board too. That's on the funding side. On the delivery side, we also work very strongly with a lot of intermediaries that are involved in the farming sector, a lot of grain aggregators, but also local delivery partners. So the Forth Rivers Trust, for example, is one of our delivery partners up in the Leven. And so other groups on here also in Europe, Preferred by Nature is an NGO who also works closely with farmers in our landscapes in Italy, Poland, and Hungary. Next one, thank you. So the way that this funding is distributed and what it's trying to aim to do on the ground is very much it's down to farmers to tell us what they wish to do on their land. So this is not a kind of cookie cut approach where farmers are given like a list of things they have to do. This is very much up to them to tell us what they want to apply for. And so in a similar vein to maybe what we're used to with SFI and other sustainable farming subsidies available in different countries, we do have a handbook that farmers can access every year and choose from what they wish to do. But generally speaking, all of our kind of measures that we make available to farmers all fall into broad categories of impact. And what we're looking for typically are measures that will have a combination of impacts in terms of soil health, water resilience, biodiversity, climate mitigation, and farmer well-being / farm business resilience building. So we're looking to maximize those outcomes through a combination of actions that we know through science-based research and evidence that they will be impactful in those landscapes. I think that's it. So maybe just next slide. So then how do we go from there to measuring impact and resilience? So this is where I'm going to show you some of the definitions and frameworks around how LENS frames these notions. Thank you. Next slide. Okay. So LENS established its own resilience framework about 2 years ago now, and this is very much what underpins how we allocate funding and what we measure. This is very much at the farm level, this framework here, and it's meant to provide a clear expectation to participate in LENS. So what it means is that farmers can have a look at where they currently sit in terms of those criteria and the principles and where they are on that journey to their transitioning to more regenerative friendly methods. And they can see what to expect in terms of being in LENS, what we expect of their progression over time. And so our compensation model, if you like, or our financial incentive model is based around where they are on that journey. So what that means is those at the beginning of their journey and those applying maybe just one or two of these criteria, not quite at the threshold that are on this diagram, might be paid on a practice by practice approach. So for example, if they're wanting to trial cover cropping, they haven't done it before, or reduce tillage, or are using other methods to tackle tackle pests, for example, they'll be paid on a measure by measure basis at a price of their setting. If on the other hand you have farmers that have been doing this for a little while and we want to continue to reward them for those efforts, we'll pay them on a more hectare basis at a flat rate. So what that means is that we can keep encouraging those that are doing well, at the same time as encouraging new starters to benefit from LENS. These criteria and principles also align with some of the corporate frameworks that our funders are keen to follow, such as the slide platform, and it just makes it easy to kind of project the direction of travel of our cohorts of farms, and just makes life a little easier to make sure that farmers know what we're expecting to measure on their farm. Next slide, please. So then, taking a step back, I'm going from the resilience at the farm level criteria to maybe more a conceptual notion of landscape-based resilience. We've started to have a look at, what does this mean for Lens in, as an initiative? Yes, our action is delivered through farms, but because we've been in operation for 5 years, we're starting to have a bit of a footprint now in different landscapes, and we wanted to be able to communicate around what does that mean at landscape level. So in a fashion, this is a bit like a theory of change, if you like, for Lens, because our mission statement is around being able to regenerate landscapes on which we all depend, and then breaking that down into actionable interventions on farms. So the way that we kind of frame resilient landscapes in our meaning means that farmlands are better able to handle droughts, floods, pest outbreaks, but also input scarcity, price volatility, etc., etc. So that whilst at the same time maintaining yields. And those are things that matter to all of those entities that come together in each of our landscapes. So breaking that down, we understand from research and science what resilience drivers tend to be at landscape level, and we have, we design our interventions in such a way that they contribute towards those drivers. So going from the drivers box at the top, we're seeing that it's the combination of those drivers that really make a difference in the landscape level in terms of resilience. And it's not just ecological benefits, but also the social aspect is equally important. So in practical terms, that means that our program is designed around, not just encouraging greater crop diversity, multifunctional land use through planting of hedgerows, having wetland scrapes, etc., etc. All sorts of farming practices that restore soil health, but also encouraging that social learning piece and knowledge exchange between farmers. And that's very much what we deliver in each of the landscapes. And then in terms of the measuring of those impacts and what that does, we have I've got some slides on that, but basically it's we're very specific around what we measure, and it's the same protocol every year. We measure year-on-year change on every single farm, and therefore at the landscape level too. And it's based on a combination of empirical data, soil sampling, as well as practice-based data collected from farmers. And we have a given set of metrics to go for each of the outcome areas, which I'll get on to the next slide, please. So this is, I hope it's clear enough. There's a lot of text on this slide. These are very much our suite of indicators that we have for 2025. We've just completed our MRV campaign and are in the process of reporting all our results. Lens is really well regarded in terms of its approach to metrics and measurement. We document all our impact through our MRV protocol with detailed methodologies and tools and how we go about it. And this protocol is updated every year. The key principles behind our measurement approach is around meeting the reporting needs of our funders first and foremost, but also providing insights for farmers. So these metrics were selected for that purpose. They have to meet multiple needs, both funders and also our farmers. More importantly, it's the same method that's used across all farms every year, and all farms are baselined the first year they join in Lens. There's a number of frameworks that we need to follow and standards, such as the Greenhouse Gas Protocol on land sector-based removals in particular, as well as SBTi flag targets. The tools that we use to collect these metrics need to be widely applicable to all landscapes. So you would have seen that we work both in UK and Europe. We need these tools to be available in different languages and configurable to different climatic areas. And then also importantly, this measurement approach needs to be affordable and with a low burden on farmers. So we're not talking about, sending ecologists on farm every year, that would be just too expensive to do, but we need to do something that's good enough, robust enough, and replicable every year on every single farm. Maybe just a mention on soil health metrics, since this webinar is focusing around soil health. Soil organic carbon is our is what we sample on every farm joining Lens, and it's the sampling protocol for each farm is based on all the fields where Lens interventions will take place, and the design is based on a statistical sampling methods, so that the cores collected are representative of the Lens fields, if you like. And then what we do in subsequent years, so in years 2 to 5, we model the changes in soil organic carbon using dedicated model service provider that has a tier, what we call a tier 3 model for soil organic carbon, and then we resample the soil again in year 5 and then compare that with the model projections. All the other parameters on the screen are derived from our questionnaires, and where we ask farmers for various land management practices that they've carried out in the year. And next slide, please. So what does that look like when we collect our data and start aggregating that for farms? So this is a snapshot of our numbers that we're able to communicate from last year's impact. This is an example from Yorkshire. So last year in Yorkshire, you will see that what we're able to measure and report are changes in water holding capacity, for example. So this is a net increase year on year on the additional water holding capacity per hectare. Likewise, we can report on reductions of nitrates concentration per hectare, metrics such as the environmental impact quotient reduction, meaning that there's less toxicity year on year in the environment due to changes in the uses of pesticide, either quantity or the type of pesticide that was chosen was probably less toxic than it was previously. We also have a tool called the biodiversity metric that is part of the Cool Farm platform, and we use that to kind of give an indication of how biodiversity habitats are, improving on farms overall. We also measure, physically in allometric terms, the amount of hedgerows and wild, other habitats created on our farms year on year. So this is kind of a bit of a snapshot of what's possible to collect at low cost. But the question really for us is, how do you go from there to telling a story around landscape resilience per se? When do these metrics become significant enough to generate positive tipping points? And I think that's a real exciting question for us, and probably a point for future research. 2 more slides. 1 more, please. The other exciting thing we can do with our data now, after we have 3 full cycles of MRV data now on all our farms, is to start to see where we're having the most impact or intervention density, if you like. Because our landscapes are quite spread out, so the east of England, for example, covers pretty much all of those different areas on the screen. So from pretty much Northamptonshire all the way to the end of East Anglia, it's quite spread out. We're not concentrated necessarily in any one catchment, but you can see here on the screen that there are pixels where there's more than 50 different types of interventions stacked in the same pixel here, and that's saying over the course of 3 years. So surely there'll be more impact in those areas, and we can zoom in and do some more research in those clusters. So there's opportunities for wider understanding of what is shifting in those landscapes, how is resilience being built, how are soils being improved, and with tools like these we can see where to start looking for more evidence. And last slide. So I was asked to give some few reflections on our work to date. What's worked well? What do we, where do we go from here? I think with regards to resilience and landscapes, it's very much depends on from which perspective you're talking about. So, farmers will value their farm business resilience and perhaps well-being, which will be different to companies, the food companies' interests, where their primary concern will be their supply resilience of their wheat, for example, to their factories, or their Scope 3 carbon reporting targets that they have to meet, whereas councils might value flood risk resilience. So it's about how do we merge those combined interests and to finding those sweet spots that can optimize all these resilience gains, and I think what Lens has demonstrated that it is possible to do that, and in fact we've been doing it now for 5 years. So what does help those using spatial coordination tools to be more targeted and have actions more concentrated in certain areas where there's a need, perhaps. I think that's an area for further of interest to us, certainly looking forward to understanding from the other presentations today what tools others have used. The second reflection for me is around scale, and scale matters for measurement. Right now we've been focusing at the farm level because that's the point of interest for our funders, and that's how we can derive important information for carbon mitigation targets, for example. And appreciate that this webinar might be more concerned about landscape in general at the higher level. So how do we kind of reconcile measurements at the farm level with landscape resilience is question. And then finally, there are other resilience drivers that I haven't talked about on this webinar, those that are perhaps a bit more out of our controls, which are more structural by nature. So for example, we're seeing in our feedback from farmers that farmer decision horizons matter in terms of decisions making how they decide to invest on their land or not. A lot of these changes in land use management are costly, so agroforestry. I'm thinking also about grazing management with fencing, wetland scrapes. All these come at a high cost, and so if you're a tenant or if you're a contractor on your farm, then you're less likely to make those decisions or to be able to invest because you don't know how long you'll be allowed on the land. That's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kat. Fantastic. We'll return to some of those reflections later in the Q&A session for the whole panel. So thanks very much for framing some of those at the outset. So we're now heading over to another Kat Moncrief. Go ahead, Kat, when you're ready.
Thank you very much. Just bear with me. Okay. So thanks very much for having me here today. I'm going to talk about our Spongy Landscapes Policy Report, which we produced at the end of March, and that draws on several case studies, many of which I think have the tools that are being talked about today are being used within those case studies. So hopefully you'll recognise some of the work here. But just quickly before I start on CIWEM, so CIWEM is the Chartered Institution of Water and Environmental Management, and we're an independent professional body, and we work with a community of professionals and practitioners across water and environmental management. So we have about 11,000 members, and we work with them to find and share best practice for nature positive solutions to address the critical challenges that we face around climate, and so flooding, drought management, pollution, coastal erosion, sustainable land management, all of those things. So on to spongy landscapes. So why did we decide to focus on this concept of spongy landscapes? Well, it's really because land is such a vital component of water and environmental management. So the water that we use and the water in our rivers are all derived from the landscape. So when water falls on the land, it runs off, it's absorbed and it's filtered by that land, and it then eventually makes its way into drains and lakes and reservoirs and the sea. So we came at this from thinking, well, if we want clean flowing rivers, safe bathing waters, clean drinking water, and less kind of stormwater deluging our homes and businesses, we need to think really seriously about how our rural landscape is managed. and especially our rural landscape, because 70% of the UK is farmland. And I probably don't really need to be telling this audience this fact, but I just wanted to explain why we were coming to this idea of landscapes and rural landscapes from SciWem. Okay, so what do we mean by a spongy landscape? Well, it's really all of the, and if you could go on to the next slide, please. Thank you. It's really all the things that Kat has already mentioned and that we'll be talking about today, but it's regenerative agriculture to improve the porosity and health of soils. It's about headwater wetlands that hold back water in the landscape, and leaky woody dams that can help with that. It's also about floodplain wetlands or wet corners of fields that can be used to store water. So it's really about a whole range of different measures that can be used to hold back, slow, store, filter water through our landscapes to achieve those outcomes for the environment and for people that I've described. So as I said, we came at this and we really wanted to understand some of the good practice that was out there and draw on that. So we had 8 what we called pioneers of spongy landscapes, and in the report those 8 case studies are featured, and they include everything from intensively farmed arable land in East Anglia, which I think some of which was part of the lens that Kat described. So from that all the way up to the peaty glens of northeast Scotland, and everything in between. So those 8 case studies reflect quite a range of different types of farmed landscape. And these case studies all use different types of modelling tools and metrics to quantify the soil holding capacity and the impact on resilience for different beneficiaries. So I'm going to just touch on a few of the case studies now, talk about very briefly what tools were used, with a view to pulling together some of the common insights and policy recommendations that would enable this kind of work to be scaled up across the farmed landscape. Okay, next slide, please. So this is one of the 8 case studies. I won't go through them all, I don't think, but I'll just pick out a few. So this is Waitrose Leckford estate that you may have come across. So they have been trying to integrate regenerative agriculture techniques across the estate, and particularly what we had in the case study was looking at fields where they had grown regeneratively farmed barley versus those that were farmed in the sort of conventional sense. And they looked at the soil organic matter content between those 2 areas and looked at the relationship between soil organic matter and water holding capacity. And there were some really stark results in the summer of 2022, which was a really dry summer, where the fields, with the regen ag techniques, those fields were able to store a whole month's worth of rain because of that increased soil organic matter, and yields were actually up by 60%. So that just demonstrates the benefit of that healthier soil with increased soil organic matter and increased soil water retention. And with each of the case studies, we looked at what kind of funding and payments were coming in to support these kind of practices. So for this one, they were using SFI for the cover crops on those regen fields. And interestingly, that SFI payment was being topped up with water company money. I think it's Southern Water down there. So the water company was seeing the benefit of those types of approaches as well. Okay, next slide. So affinity water. So I think this was part of the Lens East Anglia project that Kat mentioned. So again, this was about cover crops and companion crops. Again, actually with this one, the funding came through SFI with a water company uplift, but the focus on this was more about water quality. So they did a number of nitrogen trials and measuring soil nitrogen supply and soil mineral content there. Okay, next one. So this is the Upper Belt in Kent, another of the case studies. So here, a number of different nature-based solutions were installed, or are being installed actually. It's still growing, this project. But a number of nature-based solutions in the upper catchment, and this included headwater wetlands and also some mob grazing as well, and wet woodland. So again, an opportunity in this clay catchment to hold back water, and this was paid for through Southern Water as well. So again, you're seeing the kind of beneficiary supporting this kind of work. And the measurements that were done around this included the replenish tool, which I think Seren is going to talk about. The replenish tool is based on the volumetric water benefit accounting methodology. So that was used to quantify the amount of water held back or replenished in the upper catchment. And then some modelling, hydrological modelling, was also done to understand the impact in terms of flood risk reduction and drought resilience, so looking at the impact on low flows in the summer as well. Okay, next one. I'm just thinking whether I do them all. So I think I'll do this one and maybe then skip on a couple. So this is the Upper Calder Valley in West Yorkshire, and Seren will know about this one because Coca-Cola have been involved, and they have been making payments through the water benefit accounting methodology and replenish methodology as well. So they've been making payments for these wetlands in the upper catchment, and I think that's probably all I need to say about that one. So I'll move on, and I'll just touch on Spain's Hall Estate because I think Emily is talking about this one potentially. So this is in Essex, and this estate has a ecological plan, and they've done a number of things, including creating beaver wetlands, doing some agroforestry, also looking at other ways to improve soil health. And Atkins Realis used their NFM Studio hydrological model to try and understand what would be the water held by all of these things and future measures as well across the whole of the estate. And interestingly, if you look at all the potential water stores across the estate, then you could actually hold enough water to fill 12% of the planned Fens Reservoir in East Anglia. So that just demonstrates the kind of quantum of water that it's possible to retain and hold back in the farm landscape. Now, obviously, not all of that water is readily abstractable, but it demonstrates the kind of quantity and that kind of resilience that is possible if the land is managed in the right way. Okay, next slide, please. So I think I'm going to skip on actually to just touch on the kind of overall findings from all of these case studies. So in the report, we pulled together all the metrics and stats, some of which I've touched upon just now, but we pulled all of those together into these infographics that you can see here. And that really tried to just pull together or make the case, make that the kind of clear indication for the positive impact that these types of measures can have on volume of water retained, on flood risk reduction, on drought resilience. So pulling that all together in one place, and also looking at the kind of payments that land managers and farmers are receiving for developing these kind of measures. So all of that is is shown in the infographics in the report. If you go on to the next slide, I think this is helpful for just demonstrating some of the common enablers for these spongy landscape approaches that came out through those case studies. So firstly, the need for granular data on soil type, organic matter content, slope, runoff pathways, all of those things, so that it's possible to identify where the right measures in the right place and also quantify that impact. A second key insight was that farmer cluster groups and advisory services are absolutely critical for adopting soil health improvements and enabling those resilience measures to be taken up. We also found from the case studies that investment in modelling and independent monitoring and verification really helps to build confidence for the funders and investors, as well as for farmers that are going to take up these measures, and also for the regulators as well. It's important to use metrics and tools that provide the right kind of evidence for the business drivers of resilience. So, for example, Coca-Cola, and I'm sure Seren can talk about this more, but they very much want to use the kind of replenish metric. They've been part of developing that over the years. So it's important for them, for their business case, to have that metric. Network Rail, on the other hand, in the Cotswolds, I didn't touch on this case study, but they really wanted to understand the impact of nature-based solutions and things on flood peaks, because they'd had issues in the past. They still do have issues with flooding of the railway line there. The final insight in terms of enablers was that certainty is absolutely critical in what government can fund. So in order to attract other funding from businesses and private funders, it's really important that they understand what government's going to fund and therefore what is sort of investable. Okay, and then on to the next slide, just very quickly. These were our policy asks. So basically our asks for government based on what we heard through those 8 case study pioneers. And I can go through some of them, but I'm conscious of time. So maybe I'll just pick out 2 or 3. So if we go on to the next slide, this one about elms really, and absolutely critical. Elms is in order to help support some farmers to take up these measures, but it's not enough on its own. But what's really important is that it's consistent. There's been a lot of policy changes around elms over the last 2 years, I think, and for farmers to really have that confidence to take up measures, and for the private sector to invest, it's really important that that's absolutely, it's very clear and it's very consistent and it doesn't change. So that was like our key ask really, and also asking for stable landscape recovery and extending the 12-month termination clause in that, because that 12-month termination means that DEFRA can pull out after just a year, and that just doesn't give the confidence to businesses and private financiers to invest. Okay, and I think if we go on to the next slide, another important one was ask 3 about creating this government-led market framework to catalyse private investment. So I've already talked about that need for government certainty. And I think what we're really looking for is government to be really clear in what it is investing in. So seed funding in the form of the National Environment Investment Readiness Fund and in the form of landscape recovery has been really critical to getting investable schemes up and running. That really needs to continue. But what we found is that government also needs to support the kind of nascent private markets to get going by underwriting payments for outcomes such as flood risk and water quality that should come through in time from the likes of water companies and other businesses. But those markets are going to take time to develop. So we're saying, can you underwrite these things and enable investors and things to actually invest in the capital things at this point? Okay, and finally, I want to touch on R7, which is about landscape resilience being central to the water white paper reforms. So I think the water white paper talks about pre-pipe solutions, sort of fleetingly really, but we feel that the vital role that on-farm nature-based and land management solutions can play in improving water quality, reducing flood risk and enhancing biodiversity is not really captured in the white paper. And we really like these things, wetlands, reconnecting floodplains, improving soils to be treated as essential kind of critical infrastructure for future resilience future resilience and climate resilience. So that's really going to require a joined up approach across land use, planning and infrastructure. So we're really calling for a properly funded independent regional planning function that's going to enable that. And I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kat. We'll come back to the questions later when we're dealing with the whole panel. So we'll move on to Seren Patterson's talk now, who's from the Rivers Trust. Seren, over to you.
Thank you, Pete. And yes, good afternoon. Yes, I'm Seren Patterson. I'm Water Stewardship Manager at the Rivers Trust. So yeah, today I'm going to be talking about the volumetric water benefit accounting methodology. But to kick things off, I'll start just by introducing who the Rivers Trust are and what we do. I'll then kind of go into what water stewardship is, because I think that gives the right context then to the methodology itself. I'll then go through the methodology and then some examples of how we can kind of bring that to life a little bit more. So yes, the Rivers Trust, we're essentially the umbrella body for 65 plus member trusts across the UK. So we work across England, Scotland, Wales, and all of the island of Ireland. Our work on the island of Ireland is developing, so we've only got emerging trusts in that area, but it is a very exciting new area for us that we are developing into. Same with Scotland, we're kind of growing our member trusts in that area. But essentially, as the umbrella body, our kind of main role is building that collective voice across all of our members and really ensuring that that's heard in terms of the protection of watercourses across the UK. Next slide, please. So before going into the VWBA methodology itself, which, as Kat's also already mentioned, it can be referred to as the replenish methodology, so they can be used interchangeably just in case there was any confusion there. But I think it's important not to decouple that methodology from essentially the broader water stewardship perspective. So essentially what I mean by water stewardship, especially referring to business water stewardship, is this ladder that you can see on this slide. And I think this is a really nice way to illustrate some of the journeys that businesses are on who are typically higher water users. I think you do kind of have smaller and medium water users following the same pathway, but this is very much designed for businesses within a catchment who are abstracting a large amount of water for their business purposes. So the first step on the ladder is just for a business to have that water awareness, to essentially know how much they're using, how much do they need for their product, their services, etc. The second step is then really understanding their risk and their impact. So what can they actually do internally to look at the impact that they're having? Step 3 is that internal action. So once they've understood their risk, how can they internally act to either reduce or save water and kind of take a step at that factory setting to ensure they're being as sustainable as possible. Once they've done that, essentially, and they're certain that their factory or their site is as water secure as possible, it's essentially what can they do to look outside of that factory gate. So they're still reliant on that catchment that they're situated in to be able to abstract clean and resilient water. So what collective action projects can they invest in to actually ensure that landscape is more resilient? And that's really where the Rivers Trust come in. And that's where our local members then help deliver projects that do then make that landscape more resilient through river restoration, wetland scrape delivery, all of the stuff that we've heard about so far in the other presentations. That's essentially what we go on the ground to deliver mainly on agricultural land. I would say 80% of our projects do actually happen in rural areas, although we do work within some public spaces as well. But essentially, that is the kind of collective piece that we are all striving towards in terms of driving that resilience at a landscape scale. Step 5 is kind of leading on to what Kat at Simon was just talking about in terms of how can our work and our work with businesses especially then influence governance and policy. So how can we take this to the next level to show it's great that businesses are investing at this level, but what can the government then do to support that and create this a more kind of holistic piece that we're all kind of in this together. Next slide, please. So just to quickly cover from the business perspective, that journey they're on, the steps 1 to 3 on that ladder are very much driven by an organisation for the Alliance for Water Stewardship. And this is essentially a body which businesses can work with that essentially accredit their steps on that ladder. So for example, sites can go through certification to prove that they're essentially as water efficient as possible, but it also kind of solidifies their commitments to water stewardship. And this goes beyond just their ESG strategies. So I think a lot of times we think of business funding within CSR and kind of more light touch ESG type strategies, but this is actually going more into that business risk. So essentially that business wouldn't be able to operate without investing in these projects and in these landscapes. So yeah, as it says on the slide, this kind of provides that credibility to show that businesses are on the right path and doing what they can within an area. Next slide, please. So as we've seen within the other presentations, water stewardship and delivering these projects can never be done in isolation. There has to be a collective group of different stakeholders involved to ensure that they are a success. So some of the other actors that we work really closely with, so public bodies, so for example, with ELMS and landscape recovery, water companies are a huge part of the work that we do. We always try and kind of connect the businesses, the private businesses we work with utility companies to ensure that we're all kind of striving in the right direction. Technical partners, so a lot of the businesses that we work with are then audited on the work that they're doing. So that's a very big part of kind of our role at the Rivers Trust to ensure that we have all of that data and information available so that when they are audited, they've got all of that there. And then other NGOs and charities as well. We're trying to be as collaborative as possible, especially through the catchment-based approach. How can we kind of work with as many stakeholders as possible to make projects a success? Next slide. And this really kind of builds on unpacking collective action and what does that mean at a landscape scale. So as part of the Rivers Trust, we've also worked with WWF, TNC, WaterAid, the CEO Water Mandate to look at, well, how can we take a basin level approach and actually build out what true collective action looks like, and how can we build a blueprint so that can be then used elsewhere. We're currently doing this in the Thames Basin. There is no kind of perfect example in terms of how this is working yet. I feel like we're still very much right at the start of maybe understanding the puzzle pieces that goes into doing this, but actually implementing it at that larger scale, I think is something that we're all still working towards. But it's very much part of this water stewardship journey and what's kind of driven the creation of the methodology that I'm going to be talking about. Next slide, please. So yeah, just quickly back to our work at the Rivers Trust. So in terms of working with our local trusts, we always deliver what the catchment needs and never what the private sector wants. So if you have a business approaching you and they have a certain volume that they need to hit within a catchment, we're never driven by that number. We always go with actually what needs to happen in that area. We're also always driven by what the shared water challenge is. And that's, again, a big part of the volumetric water benefit accounting methodology. It's you can't just go and deliver a wetland because you think it's going to give you a large volume of water. It has to be answering a challenge that that catchment plan has identified. The hardest part of all of this is actually understanding the ecosystem services and not actually trying to get the funding through the door. I think that capacity and development of building out what's actually needed within a landscape is much harder. Our work with farmers and landowners underpins all of this work. If we didn't have those relationships through our local trusts, none of this work would happen. As I said, 80 to 90% of our work is delivered on agricultural land, and it's those relationships that really drive this work forward. Capacity, capability, and culture are definitely the greatest constraints when we're trying to kind of build out and scale our work, but we're always driven by the outcomes and never income. Next slide. So yeah, just very quickly, this is a slide on who funds our work currently around Replenish or VWBA. So as Kat mentioned, so Coca-Cola are our longest standing partner. They were very much part of this work over 10 years ago in actually understanding and building out what Replenish means and contributing towards how that methodology has developed. So beverage and drink manufacturers are a massive water user within a lot of the catchments we work in. Therefore, they do kind of make up quite a large proportion of the funding we receive. Data centers has been a new one for us over the last 3 to 4 years. So we work with AWS, Meta, and Apple. And essentially, they're obviously very interested in ensuring water resilience, given that their data centers rely on a huge amount of water for cooling their infrastructure. And also supermarkets. So we work with Sainsbury's, Lidl, Asda, and that's been a really interesting journey in that sometimes we're approached by supermarkets from their store and flooding perspective, but I feel that that's evolved massively to actually looking across their supply chains and looking at how we can make farms more resilient through the interventions that we can deliver through VWBA, and also the banking sector as well, which I know that's already been mentioned. Next slide, please. So yes, what is VWBA essentially? What is the methodology that we're talking about? Next slide. So essentially, volumetric water benefit accounting, or Replenish as it's easier to say, is a methodology that was written by the WRI and Limnatech. And it's essentially a methodology of two halves. There's a technical part that really goes into the detail in terms of how you quantify the amount of water that's either stored or treated through interventions. And when I say interventions, I mean ponds, scrapes, wetlands, land use change, essentially a whole host of different things. And then the other side of the methodology is the governance side. So when a business invests in a project, what governance and rules of engagement do they need to ensure that they're credibly claiming those volumes of water? So the methodology is written from a global perspective, so it doesn't give any kind of local context. So when you're reading through the technical guidance, it doesn't specifically say, this is what you need to do at a local level to essentially derive the amount of water. You have to apply a lot of that yourself. So a few years ago, we received some funding through NERF to develop essentially what we've called our Replenish tool, or our benefits calculator. And essentially we've plugged a lot of the missing puzzle pieces in terms of the UK context for some of those missing pieces. So for example, soil types is a huge part that comes into calculating the volumes derived from these interventions. And we've had to spend a lot of time making sure that all of that data is kind of built into our tool, so that when our member trusts go to look at different types of interventions across the country, we've made it as easy as possible for them in terms of the inputs they need to then derive their volume of water. As I've said, so the calculator itself is only available to the Rivers Trust movement at present. We provide training to our member trusts on how to use it, but it ensures that there is that standardized approach then, so that when we are working across Replenish projects, the volumes that we're getting are consistent. And I will say that the VWBA methodology has been very much written from that business perspective, and it's a voluntary methodology. So it's publicly available, but essentially it would never be used by, let's say, a utility company that is mandated and is regulated, because it doesn't go far enough in trying to prove what's actually happening on the ground. It's still very much a voluntary methodology that only goes so far in showing what's actually happening. So from that business perspective, it kind of provides everything that's needed, but from a regulatory perspective, it wouldn't go far enough. We do then provide guidance in terms of story maps and technical documents to go alongside the calculator as well to our movement. Next slide, please. So what can we actually calculate through the toolbox? So this is the list of interventions that we currently have available. So the most popular ones that we use for replenish are offline ponds for volume stored, also offline ponds for volume treated. So that's looking at water quality, and online ponds for water quality as well. We do also do a lot with floodplain increase and restoration, but there are a lot of interventions on here that wouldn't essentially traditionally be used as part of a replenish portfolio. So for example, within our land use change category, if you were planting a woodland, I would suspect the volume of water that you're then replenishing would be quite small, in which case you wouldn't be attracting the private finance necessary to deliver that scheme. So we definitely don't see replenish as this silver bullet that's going to essentially fund all interventions across the country. I think what we see replenish is as a tool within a much larger toolbox that you can apply essentially when that intervention is hitting the volumes that you think a business would be interested in. So yeah, it's important to kind of remember that it's not going to answer all problems, but it can do for some types. And yeah, again, as this is a soils webinar, as I've mentioned, essentially the soil type underpins all of these interventions, and depending on where you are in the country, that will massively influence the amount of water that's either kind of stored or held. Next slide, please. So in terms of the governance side of the methodology that I referenced, there are rules of engagement for businesses around once you've invested in a project, what does that mean in terms of claiming those volumes? So the methodology itself is quite loose in terms of how long you can actually claim those volumes for. So the Rivers Trust have developed a policy where we believe that 10 years is the maximum amount of time that a business would be able to claim a yearly volume. After this point in time, that intervention would need to be completely reevaluated to check that it was still functioning as intended. But within that 10 years, the business must invest in the monitoring, maintenance and reporting of that intervention. So they can't just invest in something and then leave it for 10 years and continue to claim those benefits. They have to show continued engagement, which we've kind of built into our strategy. And the reporting side also comes into them being audited and us being able to provide the information needed to ensure that they can then credibly claim those volumes through their auditor. And obviously, we also do lots of site visits to make sure we get people out and about to see everything that's been done as well. Next slide. So back to kind of that bigger collective action piece, I recognise through what I've just presented, it's kind of tailored more to individual investment and interventions, whereas as the Rivers Trust, what we're striving to do is to really drive that collective action piece, in which we want multiple funders to be involved so we can create bigger, better things on the ground. The methodology itself is very clear in terms of how cost share benefit works in terms of this approach. So for example, if you have a number of different businesses, but one business only inputs 20% of the costs, they can only claim 20% of the volumes from that project. That's very simple how that's worked out. We've also started to work through how you could stack these payments with BNG. So we have done this within our landscape recovery project. So we've got a paper that clearly outlines how this can work. But it does mean that you kind of have to separate out your interventions. We haven't been able to solve yet a single site project where you can stack carbon, BNG and replenish, because unfortunately they all use very similar metrics, so we don't want to end up in the double counting space. So that's something that we're still working through. But again, yeah, this is something that I think the Rivers Trust are really keen to be working on over the next year, is trying to kind of drive these much bigger scales of projects and how it all works together. Next slide. So just to show the kind of scale and impact of the funding that we're referring to through VWBA, this map is a little bit out of date now. So the capital that we've leveraged is probably closer to 9 million across the country. And the water replenish is probably much closer to 6 million now across all of our different sites. But as you can see, there's a nice widespread amount of projects that we have. And again, they're all delivered by our local Rivers Trusts on the ground. Next slide. So just again, to give a quick example of the types of partnerships and the amount of time that these partnerships have existed for, I'll just give a quick example of our relationship with Coke. So again, this is closer to a 13-year relationship now rather than a 10, but next slide. But essentially it first began in Norfolk. So essentially back in 2013, Coca-Cola sourced a lot of their sugar beet from farms in Norfolk. And they decided that they wanted to implement a water-friendly farming program across the area. So they invested in hundreds of different interventions across these sites. I think we've got close to 2 million meters cubed of water replenished across this whole portfolio. And they've been kind of continuing investing in this area since back in 2013. And it's a really good demonstrator of how, I guess, even smaller interventions, the more you do, the more impact you have. And it's now an incredibly vast program of work that I think is a testament to what VWBA can deliver. Next slide. And since then, they've also expanded their portfolio. So as well as investing in Norfolk, they are also investing around their high impact bottling sites. So in Wakefield, as Kat mentioned in her presentation, Calder Rivers Trust work with the CCEP bottling site. So it's their largest bottling site in Europe. So again, obviously requiring a huge amount of water and really wanting to ensure water security in that area. They've got a huge replenish target and they're now investing in multiple different schemes across that landscape. But also in Sidcup in London, they have a smaller bottling site, but again, given that's in the Thames Basin and a lot of the kind of water issues that we have there, they are actively supporting projects across that area as well. So they are investing in more than 20 projects now across the country, which is brilliant. Next slide. And this is just an example of, again, one of those projects. So this is Chambermead in southeast London, and this is a series of kind of wetland cells that's supporting the local Hogsmill River, which is a rare chalk stream system. And essentially the feature itself is designed to kind of help the pollution. It's also comes off of a water sewage treatment plant. So again, it's kind of dealing with a lot of effluent, and it's provided a huge amount of new habitat and green space for that area. We've also just released water voles into this new area as well. So I think it's important to remember that with these projects, even though the business angle is coming from the water side, it's obviously providing a whole host of other different benefits that aren't kind of specifically covered in this presentation. And this is a great project in that it really demonstrates that collective action piece, in that we had 7 different funders interested in this project, which is why on the slide you can see that Coca-Cola's replenish claim is slightly smaller than the total 700,000 meters cubes of water that this wetland is treating.
Sharon,
yes.
Could we skip on a bit, please, because we've got another speaker, and I'd like to save some time for questions.
Yeah, absolutely. If you just maybe want to just skip to the last slide. The 2 slides I just had in between were just more examples of the type of interventions that we deliver and the amount of water stored. But yes, we'll skip right to the last slide, which is essentially, again, coming back to that collective action story, in that, yes, we work directly with our member trusts on providing replenish calculations for interventions, but we are really keen to work with other catchment-based approach partners and anyone else who's kind of interested in replenish. So we're working with Nattergal, so one of the reports you can see on screen there. So we've done a VWA report for their High Fen site, and we actually worked with the Forth Rivers Trust on their Lens project to identify, again, some replenish opportunities on some of the farms up in Scotland. So yeah, just I'll end there in terms of, we are open to collaboration and really want to be able to share our knowledge and experience in this area. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Sarah. And sorry for interrupting there.
No problem.
That was great. Perfect. So moving on to our next speaker, our last speaker of the day is Emily Brown from Atkins Realis. Go ahead, Emily.
Hi there. Thank you. Thanks for inviting me along today. And some brilliant, fantastic presentations. So great to see what everyone else is up to in this space as well. Today I'm going to talk about the Soil Carbon and Water Resilience Project, which is a project we undertook about last year in collaboration with John Storkey Rothamsted, Tim at the North East Cotswolds Farmer Cluster, and Chris Sauder of Carbon Quester. And this was a project that was funded through the Environment Agency as well. I'm a catchment scientist, I suppose, Atkins Realis, and I really sort of sit in this nature-based solutions space, and really interested in how we quantify different ecosystem service benefits that measures provide and build up business cases to get these kind of measures implemented at scale. So on the next slide, this is just me trying to summarize how I've ended up talking about soil. I started my career looking at natural flood management in more detail, and there we were thinking about how soils influence water and how water travels through the landscape and results in flooding, and how it can help contribute towards flood risk benefits. And it's great to have a bit more of a focus on soils as the sole focus, and seeing a lot more projects and other people in this kind of space as well, as we've talked about already today. So really thinking about the impact of water on soils rather than soils on water. So some real nice distinguishing of focus there. On the next slide, so here I just talk through some of the early natural flood management modelling that we've been doing for the North East Cotswolds Farmer Cluster. So this is a catchment called Even Load catchment. It's a tributary of the Thames just upstream of Oxford, and this is a catchment where we've been running the Atkins Realis NFM Studio tool, looking at what measures can do to reduce flood risk downstream, and particularly nature-based solutions and soils. And so here we're applying an unconstrained implementation of soil management to increase spongy landscapes, I suppose, increase soil water capacity at scale, and what that then means in terms of volumes and impacts on flood peak. So here you can sort of see some of the graphics and metrics coming out. We calculated about 789 Olympic swimming pools of water volume that can be stored in the soils across the whole, admittedly quite large catchment, if unconstrained soil management was applied. And this is approximately results in a 20% reduction in flood peak. So again, at scale, there are some big benefits to be had. On the next slide. So this just talks through the modelling approach that is embedded in the NFM Studio, and which we've sort of taken forward to various different applications. And it's a land runoff model called the daily based Morgan-Finney model there. And essentially it's a bucket style model where the model inputs on soil texture around porosity and conductivity and slope determine the size of that bucket, and we apply rainfall and allow some interception and infiltration metrics, and can understand how much space is in that soil, how much water can fill that soil, and then once rainfall exceeds that capacity, how much water is generating runoff from those soil columns. It's a fairly simplistic modelling approach, but this is quite helpful to really dive into the different parameters and factors that are influencing a very complex soil system. And until very recently, major limitations have been the input data, and deriving national scale open source soil data has been notoriously very difficult to do, and in previous modelling studies, and we've been relying on the parent material model to derive soil texture parameters from that, which obviously is a fairly low spatial resolution and very hard to pick up that local variability. However, I'm going to have to adjust my slides because until very recently we've had the publishing of the national soils data sets as well, so it's great to see that limitation starting to be addressed. On the next slide, please. So acknowledging this sort of limitation in the soils data sets, this sort of led on to this collaboration with Carbon Quester, Rothamsted and the North East Cotswolds Farmer Cluster, who were really going out and addressing this data limitation by gathering a whole host of soil sample data sets to build up this huge database across the Cotswolds region. So this map just shows the point locations of the 620 soil samples that have been taken across the region, across different soil types, different land covers, and also different farms been sampled as well to straddle different farming practices and management types. And this sort of soil carbon texture database really offered an opportunity to provide a lot more variability and understanding into some of the, not only just the soil carbon modelling, which Rothamsted have been leading on, but also the soil water capacities and updating some of that coarse input data set into the modelling approach there. So on the next slide, I just introduced some of the project aims here of the Soil Carbon Water Resilience Project, and this was really to start to integrate that dual lens of looking at soil ecosystem service benefits from carbon and water benefits in tandem, and using that empirical data set to really improve resolution and understanding of these soil carbon and water service benefits, and also to think about uplifts and future changes and how that might influence soil carbon and water storages post land use changes, which I suppose is what we all want to think about when seeing some of these brilliant projects being delivered. So on the next slide, please. So to start with, we took that empirical data set and mapped it to be able to really show side by side the dual benefits of soil carbon and soil water capacities. So here we're taking that soil texture data and putting it through the land runoff model to look at the soil water capacities of each of those soil samples, and next to the mapped soil organic carbon benefits from that soil sampled data sets as well. And like I say, it's great to be able to use this sampled data and the importance of that in some of these modelling approaches. Next slide, please. And then looking at a bit more detail, we picked out a particular soil series that was quite common across the even load catchment here, which is the Elmpton soil series, and looked at mapping and sort of graphing up those soil carbon stocks for the two broad land cover types that were sampled, both the arable and the grassland, and the same for the water capacities, again looking at arable and grassland, and starting to draw some statistical relationships between carbon and water benefits. It's well understood that increases in carbon lead to increases in soil carbon lead to increases in soil water capacities. So really great to be able to demonstrate that in our data sets as well. And you can sort of see that as the grassland is higher in the carbon, it's also higher in the water, but perhaps not by the same. It's not a one-to-one relationship, but there is a sort of pattern of as one increases, the other increases. On the next slide, please. So yeah, as I mentioned, we also were interested in looking at land use change scenarios, and this was something that is particularly important for the North East Cotswolds Farm Cluster. as they are involved in the Even Load Landscape Recovery project, and therefore looking at implementing land use change at scale, which is great. And these 3 scenarios were picked out again to support the proposed land use changes that are being considered by the Landscape Recovery project, and then thinking about how that might lead to soil organic carbon changes that has been modelled through the Ross-C model with Rothamsted. So looking at over time how soil organic carbon will build up under those 3 different land use change scenarios, and as well as thinking about the changes to the soil carbon, the model's also thinking about changes to the soil textures, which is obviously very helpful input to the water holding capacity modelling, and it's quite interesting to see that the differences here between the projections and the 3 land use change scenarios. So the floodplain meadows increase, but the improved grasslands increase sort of at a higher rate due to the sort of rapid growth of this type of vegetation, and leading to more sort of organic matter being grown, I suppose, and then sequestered into the soil, and then the herbal lay sort of zigzag somewhere in the middle, reflecting sort of gains and then sort of losses in soil organic carbon as the sort of period switch between the arable rotations in that herbal lay scenario. On to the next slide. So this soil carbon and water resilience project then sort of worked up various case studies for the different soil types, thinking or identifying fields that were about to go through these land use change scenarios under these different soil types, and modelling the uplift or the baselines first, and then modelling the uplifts in soil carbon and soil water together. Good news is that they both parameters increase for all 3 scenarios. So we're seeing benefits to soil water and soil carbon across all the 3 scenarios. The largest benefits to soil carbon are seen in the improved grassland scenario, as I mentioned, linked to the sort of rapid vegetation growth due to from the grassland, and that then sequesters the carbon into the soil through sort of the decomposition of that. And the largest benefits in water are sort of holding capacity, as seen in the herbal lay and improved grassland scenarios, again linked to the sort of relationship with the carbon and the sort of improvements in the soil texture due to the improvements in the soil carbon. So the sort of interdependencies there. I will just mention the floodplain scenario as well. We did a bit more work on that, and some of the carbon modelling dug a bit down into that in a bit more detail, partly due to the sort of more complex nature of floodplain soils, and you sort of, I suppose, expect to see a slightly higher baseline due to the sort of soil properties in these sort of wetter environments, but due to that sort of wetting, drying cycles, there is a lot more complexity, as I'm sure you understand. So yeah, an interesting space, definitely thinking about the water and carbon benefits combined in these sort of floodplain settings. And then I think I'm on to my last slide here, just some project summaries. Just thinking about some of the findings, again, there was that link between soil carbon and water. The soil texture was driving a lot of our soil water variability, partly due to the modelling approach taken, and that land use change choices, should be taken at the fields level. Lots of different environmental variables and farm business decisions to be taken when thinking about those land use changes. There's limitations in any modelling, and some of the ones in the carbon link again to the floodplain soils, that the carbon modelling, again, thinking about that saturation, drying cycles, and that carbon fluxes in more sort of saturated wetland soils are much more complicated. And again, some assumptions in the water volumetric modelling, being that, you know, at the moment it's a simplistic approach to try and understand which are the key drivers. At the moment, sort of soil compaction and other measures or things that impact the or impede water entering the soil aren't necessarily taken into consideration. And we've sort of been touched on in some of the other presentations, but this then ability for the additional water to be available during droughty periods, something that I'm quite interested in, perhaps will get picked up in the discussion, but where that water goes once it's in the soil, obviously it's nice to be able to think that it's available during the drought periods, but that may not always be the case, and it's always available to plants and not necessarily as humans for abstraction purposes. And again, the limitation there on basing our soil water modelling quite strongly against the soil texture factors. But no, that's me in a nutshell.
Thank you very much, Emily.
Thank you.
So we pushed right up against our limit of time, and luckily some of the questions that we're prepared to ask you've actually dealt with in your final slides of your presentations, each of the speakers, so that's fantastic. But we do have some more questions that we'd like to ask in a follow-up. We'll probably do this by follow-up email since we pushed right up against the time, and that will help us. What we're going to do is provide a briefing note that accompanies this recording, so we could flesh these questions out. Ellie has typed in a bunch of questions that she's asking in the private chat, but I don't think we have time to go through those now. So what we're going to do, if you don't mind, we're going to follow up by email. We'll pose those questions to you, and then you can get back to us, and we can shape that into a briefing note that we're all happy with. So thanks very much for joining. I think the recording is going to stop quite soon.